Hey guys, this is Mikro. This is a video on the PTR, what I think a sample war roster will be like. The biggest changes, well, I've talked about this, you guys should know the changes already at this point, but this roster is basically based off the assumption that most groups would not be able to function how they were before because of the fortified changes, and a lot of this roster build was around building for weaken, because even though you don't have access to consistent fortify, typically weaken is going to be a way to sort of provide fortify, but it has to be used somewhat offensively. The counter to this is weaken cannot typically be applied to ranged targets, so it's something that will have to be looked at. But this is kind of what I threw together in terms of a sample roster. I think the immediate reaction to this is this patch in general is like, oh, you need to slot fire staffs, and yes, there are more fire staff slotted than typical. But the thing with the fire staff is it's not like a tank role. It's not a role that you can slot in every group. It's not super versatile. Like Great Axe Warhammer can be slotted in heavy, can be slotted in medium, can be slotted in light. IGBB can typically be slotted in heavy, medium, and light. A lot of these builds can be slotted across multiple roles. IGVG does everything for that, like any support class wants to, and basically any roles that terms of heavy, medium, and light, but it's typically run in medium and heavy. In recent patches, Fire Staff doesn't really have that luxury and has to be run in light. And the other thing too is if people run too many Fire Staffs, they'll just get gemmed against. And I think in general that's probably just going to happen where Fire Staff gets heavily gemmed against because it's the main thing is going to be nuking people. So if you slot too many of them, then you're going to run into diminishing returns. There, I imagine there's also some reactions that are like, oh, you can't slot musket anymore. The thing with Musk is it still outranges any weapon in the game, even if it's like kind of shit. So someone will figure out a way to get value out of it. It'll be like slower paced, but that doesn't mean it still won't get value, and it will imagine will typically be slotted. But the biggest change I'd say is you'd probably want more kill squad groups than typical in next patch because Fire Staff is so good. That being said, I do not slot a lot of Fire Staff and kill squads because I'm incorporating them into regular groups because I think they're better used in a regular group. And then at that point, your ball is like sort of like kill squad, but it's like a little bit more tanky. And then in general, Great Axe Warhammer is slotted as an engage util role instead of as a DPS role. Spear IG is also in that area as like a util role, but also has good DPS. These Spear IG slots are mostly in medium. There are some that would be in heavy, and then there's some others in Kill Squad that would be in light. The reason why Spear is very seems like it will be very powerful is mostly because it has access to weaken on 2 abilities and a knockdown, which will not be affected by freedom. Inherently, Spear has a really strong kit next patch, and is able to have access to grit and 150 dex, which means it will be able to effectively deal with Fire Staff BBs because it has access to so many iframes to be able to dodge the key abilities that it needs to in order to close distance, which other builds won't have access to. The two builds that will be able to have access to that sort of thing are Greatsword and Spear. And it seems like Spear has the better util between Greatsword and Spear next patch, and also might have more consistent damage output with how the Spear passives work. So in general for this, I think Spear is slotted mostly as a default. There are some spots where I think a Great Axe and a Great Sword tend to still get more value, like Light Great Axe, Great Sword's a really good build at closing the distance versus really squishy people, and having essentially infinite chase and infinite kite with that kit. It will be a little bit less kite because you won't be able to get that haste without hitting someone with in Relentless Rush when you use an ability, but it will still be a lot of kite, and they will figure out a way to get a lot of value with that, I imagine, but just using the charge to get out rather than as an engage. So I would suspect that build is still going to be strong, but hopping through this, and Daddy, I think Heavy Greatsword Warhammer is a very good slot next patch as a util based role for the mostly for the weekend and for the ability to group people who then can be nuked by other groups. I think you have to slot an IGVG with Great Axe Warhammers in order for them to get value, otherwise they're mostly dead slots. And I think double group heal makes a lot of sense. AoE heal does not make a lot of sense because on live orb it tends to be more of a debuff than a buff. And what I mean by that is the Fortify does not inherently provide a lot of value. Like, I believe it provides about 3.75% protection. If you were comparing that to gems, that's like the effectiveness of like a gem and a half to like one of those types. It's not super good, and it overall can set up people more for debuffs with invigorated punishment interactions and buffs itself. So at that point, you're kind of looking at two group heals that are probably not even running orb. If those fortify changes get fixed, one of them will probably be on orb, but one of these is probably running clap, and then the other one is probably not running clap, and it's just a very heavy pocket the Great Axe Warhammer kind of role and let your Great Axe Warhammer play aggro because they won't have access to so much fortify. They will need the extra help from healers, I think, to be able to live next patch, and which is another reason why I think they need to be in heavy. Uh, Getting to the other group, I think heavy SNS is really good. Spear is like kind of a different look that I've seen a little bit. I could also see this being IGVG. It will probably end up being IGVG, but Spear is something I think that people are going to try, and it will either have a lot of success or it will just be worse than IGVG. On current patch, people tend to play this with Void Gauntlet. I don't think it makes sense to play with the Void Gauntlet next patch because you don't have access to unlimited stamina. And with Void Gauntlet, with SNS, you tend to have times where it doesn't make a lot of sense to like what you should be doing because you can't really be aggro with your Void Gauntlet. Yeah, kind of have to be passive and let people come for you and look for screams. But those screams won't get as much value as live because you don't have access to 300 con, the extended root duration. So I don't think it necessarily makes sense to use that. I think this is probably a Spear or IG secondary at this point. I could also see a situation where someone wants to slot more than one SNS because the weekend is just so strong. Like I could see it being slotted in a Dedi group and even in ball groups as like a 2 or 3 of because I think SNS is actually the strongest build in the game. It just happens to be a build that you can't run a lot of. So even though it tends to be stronger than other builds, like I don't think you want to run like two SNS builds in one gate. But I could see people wanting to run like two SNS is put one on B gate all the time and then one rotates between A and C or something like that for different crashes and just helps that gate like really breach through. The other noteworthy thing is that SNS tends to get a lot of value next patch because the Fortify is happening before the actual other calculation, and it tends to be more aligned with how old Fortify was rather than the new Fortify, so it's actually impactful. And the grit also helps SNS just get more value in providing debuffs. I have another Dedi group on here. I don't know if this Dedi group will actually stay around, but I imagine these first two will. But this would be like your two heavy IGBB slot. These guys would be playing for Bile and be trying to cycle those as much as possible. I threw an IGVG there and a Spear IG. I could also see this being like a triple IGBB, one Spear IG. I think you do want to have a Spear on B, just for the weekend basically, and a little bit of the CC. So I could see this being dropping to IGVG, or I could see this dropping a Spear for a BB as well. The reason why IGBB is kind of interesting is because the Bile cycle, but Spear IG is also really good at cycling Bile, and I imagine that you can cycle Bile with all three of these builds. And you don't necessarily need the Stone Form, because Stone Form is actually more of a debuff than a buff next patch for the Spear. So I could see this being played. I could also see IGBBs being played there. IGBB itself is not like a super tanky role, but the AoE util and the AoE disease I imagine will provide a decent amount of value next patch. I would just run one group heal with that group though, because you have like less heal intensive people. Ball groups, these are all formatted the same. I think this is the strongest ball setup next patch. You have a Great Axe Warhammer that's for the primary engage. You have a Spear IG that's more of a secondary engage, kind of a enforcer kind of role from other games. Firestaff BB is there to provide most of the damage and nuke things, and IGVG is there to help set up the Spear and help set up the Great Axe. Firestaff BB will be likely on light and will be trying to hard carry and will be hitting clumps, which is different from typical Firestaff BB, but there won't be as many clumps next patch and it will be more spread, I imagine, so that will just turn out to get more value. The main reason why you're running Spear and not another Great Axe Warhammer is again for the weekends, for the knockdown, and just because Spear tends to set up Great Axe Warhammer, I think even on live, sort of underratedly, a little bit better than another Great Axe Warhammer sets up a Great Axe Warhammer, which doesn't make a lot of sense till you play around with it, but Spear feels very, very strong, and I don't see a reason to not slot it in a ball group. In kill squads, I already talked about this a little bit, but light great axe Warhammer or light greatsword Warhammer tends to get a lot of value in closing the distance. Firestaff VB is just a really solid build. Probably going to be the most meta build of this next patch. I could also see like some of these slots being IGs if you wanted to, but I think BB provides a little bit more because it's able to handle that close range pressure and that like range pressure. I would probably not go like mortar BB in these ball groups, but it would be interesting in the kill squad group if you do that. But you're basically there just to provide nuking sort of value to those clumps. The BB in this kill squad is more of a solo BB than the others, but I imagine people will find a way to get value. If there was a group where you'd want to run Ice Gauntlet, it would probably be in this group. But Ice Gauntlet with Fire Staff isn't bad. It's just BB with Fire Staff I think does a little bit more on next patch. Light Spear Rapier is more of an experimental thing that I imagine will get tried, but same concept as before. Weaken helps keep people alive, provides a lot of debuffs, and is able to survive pretty well with the Rapier. I don't know if you actually run the repost or not, because repost seems to be more of a debuff than a buff versus ranged targets, and I imagine it's going to be a ranged meta, so that will be interesting. But Spear Rapier, I think, is going to be something that is tried. I don't know if it will see success, but I think sounds a little bit better than other builds that you could slot in this group. Another kill squad group, SNS, mostly for the leadership, and then kind of a bow musket hybrid group. I think if you go musket bow, you're probably just going to get farmed next patch by like random fireballs that hit you, unless you're in fort on defense, in which case musket bow can be really good. But I imagine people figure out a way to play around that. Musket is in a really bad spot next patch, but that doesn't mean it's useless. It still provides a lot of util because it's a class that inherently can outrange everything in the game, and the fall off damage to it isn't significant. It's just the ability to hit shots consecutively that is gonna get nerfed a lot. That being said, it will still provide a threat that will likely have to be dealt with, and I think will still get slotted, but will not be slotted as much. I could also see this just being like a one of. The main reason why I'm looking at bows in the kill squad is because if you don't slot bows and you only slot fire staffs, then people are just going to heavily ward to fire, and when people heavily ward to fire, then bows tend to get a lot of value, right? So I think it makes sense to slot a balance of both, and then you can kind of pressure people with those. I wouldn't like all in on one or the other, but I still think it makes sense to have a balance, even though bow got nerfed. But even though bow got nerfed a bit and fire staff got buffed a lot, if people ward to Firestaff, bow might feel more strong than Firestaff with just the way that people are warding to the specific meta itself. It's really hard for people to ward to physical because they want to ward to slash and they want to ward to thrust. So they have to ward to general physical, which makes it less effective. So that's another reason why I think bow can get more value next patch. Medium spear hatchet I have also with the kill squad with the bows. I think this will just set up bows really well. It's something that has been tried recently on defense. It seems like it's pretty strong. On attack it seems a little bit worse, and Greatsword Hatchet seems to be a little bit better. I don't know if that trend will continue or not, but Greatsword Hatchet is more of a looking to be more of a one or two of. It is not a bad build. It's just spear I think inherently just provides more value mainly because of the weakens next patch. If you land a 40% weaken on someone for 8 seconds, that means they're not really doing good damage, and the people that have the least amount of weakens on them will tend to do more damage, and there will be a lot of debuffs that are thrown out. And I imagine things that tended to pad more in previous metals will actually get value because cleanses will be forced a lot by the amount of debuffs that are going out. Because 40% weaken is not something that you can ignore, and spear can get up to 70% weaken, and that's something you really can't ignore. And you might even have to pop a cleanse for that instead of popping it to keep yourself alive in order to actually have a damage output. But most of the damage output, I imagine, will be be due to ranged for that reason, because range will not be affected by weakens. But I imagine we'll be going into a weakened meta unless the fortify stuff changes significantly. And even if the fortify stuff changes significantly, weaken is still looking really, really strong next patch. In terms of like how this would be played outside of Fort, this would be like pretty standard in terms of like kind of forcing point with your daddy groups. Your balls are controlling around the point. Notice there's 4 balls, so I would imagine that you'd play this in a quadrant system where you're trying to control like half the areas and maybe stack 2 balls on one side, and you're trying to control either left or right side of point. And then your kill squad is mostly either protecting your healers or trying to kill the enemy healers. I'm a bigger fan of trying to kill the enemy healers and protecting your healers, and letting normal groups try to protect their own healers, but it's a preference. and I think that will be how it's played outside of Fort primarily. Inside of Fort, I think this is a very easy candidate for the kind of bow PR-ish meta that has developed as of recent. And you'd likely want to stack 20 to 30 people in B gate and then send others to A and C and do pushes accordingly. You'd be trying to basically outrange damage people in that choke, and a lot of this would be based around SNS and playing around that hero or that person. But if you stack too many people in choke and you're not able to live, that means that you probably need to split more. And if you split more, I think it makes sense to run more than one SNS. It would be interesting to see if people would try to swap to SNS in the fort because that's where it tends to get the most value, but still will get value outside of fort because people will struggle to live a little bit more next patch than this current one. And SNS is a really easy way to prevent that. So I could see some people, like, say you have a Spear IG, maybe they swap to SNS Spear, and then they put one of those guys on A and one of those guys on C to help people walk in that way. And they still have the Spear to get most of the value, but they won't have as much value as before. And then maybe to compensate for that, you have Firestaff go Firestaff IG, and to use those free, like, gear slots to just be able to switch specs immediately during a war and be able to do that much faster than the current patch with those changes, and that would allow you to be a little bit more dynamic when it comes to playing for outside fort versus inside of fort, and it could have people that are basically playing two specs in a war that way. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. I hope this kind of makes sense for you guys in terms of like what you should be looking for, but I would not sleep on Spear. It seems very, very strong if you haven't tried it. I don't think as many people are queuing OPR anymore on the PTR, but even if you try Spear on live, you will kind of feel that it feels a little bit better than you would think inherently, and it's going to get buffed even more when it comes to PTR. So, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.